My experience with intentional communities is broad, however, it's overwhelmingly focused on the United States. I have traveled abroad a little, and I have visited some communities abroad. I'm aware of literature and, of course, have many friends who have traveled abroad. So my information is softer, more secondhand, and I'm less sure of my footing, although I'm quite confident of my footing in the United States context. One thing that stands out about the United States is there is no state-supported effort to build communities in a direct sense. Now, there are communities that have been successful in getting federal or state money to support certain kinds of experiments, especially technological ones. They may get grants for energy-efficient experiments or construction, and that's generally, though, means that they've gotten support to do what they wanted to do rather than they've changed their program to fit where the money is. So I think it's not really been the money available to support what they're doing hasn't caused them to change what they do. It has made it possible to experiment with what they wanted to do. There is no money to create state-funded or federal-funded communities, to my knowledge, in the United States. So this is all done privately. Now, it is much easier, in general, to buy private land and establish communities on them then it's easier to buy land, is what it is in the United States, than it is in many countries. And therefore, if what you want to do with that land is create a community, then that's not necessarily an economic barrier. You still have to figure out how to pay it off. However, it's still a doable thing. Now, today, it's harder than it was 30 years ago, which I mean is the real dollars it takes you to buy the land land has gone up faster than inflation, is what I'm trying to say. So the amount of your purchasing power it takes to buy and finance the mortgage of a piece of property is a bigger hill to cross or hurdle to jump than it was 30 years ago. However, it's not uncrossable, and it is much more difficult, in my understanding, in other countries. There was a big surge, for instance, in Germany with certain community experiments because of relatively inexpensive land suddenly available through unification with East Germany. So you'll find a number of communities located in land there. Zeg, for instance, interestingly enough, they have taken over a facility and reclaimed one that was a former Stasi training facility, that's the East German secret police, when that all was disbanded. So talk about the challenge of changing the juju of a piece of property. That's hard it boggles the mind. However, there were opportunities available in the early 90s just because suddenly all this stuff with a depressed economy was available, and there was this suppressed demand because it was so hard to buy land in West Germany. But however, that's a one-time thing. And so it is very daunting for European communities to actually control the land or be able to finance it. However, there is state interest in supporting some of those experiments. And I don't know all the details of that. I can't speak responsibly to it, so I'm not going to attempt to. In the United States, then, I would say there's a higher concentration of intentional communities, to my knowledge, in the United States than any other country, excepting perhaps Israel. It's hard for me to get a good grip on that because there, right from the beginning, there was state-supported interest in supporting the kibbutzim. Kibbutzim membership is declining today. However, it still probably represents about 2% of the Israeli population. In the United States, the FIC thinks that there's about 100,000 people that live in some form of self-identified intentional community. In a country of 300 million, that means 0.03 of 1%, which means it's 1/100th as likely in the United States that somebody lives in an intentional community as lives in one in Israel. That's a huge percentage difference. In Israel, everyone knows about kibbutzim. They may not live one, but they all know about it. No one is ignorant of its existence. In the United States, it's still common to talk to somebody on the street and they don't have any idea that intentional communities exist. It might be a vague memory of, oh, that's something that happened in the 60s, wasn't it? That kind of thing. It's not unheard of that you run into people that know about intentional communities, but it's still an undertold story where our numbers are that small. There are certain possibilities in the United States and perhaps in Canada as well, though I'm less sure of my footing in talking about Canada, that have supported some kinds of intentional communities historically, especially religious groups, which far and away are the longest lived ones from a historic perspective. One of the things I'm going to get back to this question of of how that works in a minute. I want to frame, though, that one of the things that's special about today's intentional communities movement is the explosion of secular groups. That is, many of the new starts today don't have a spiritual focus. That is, they're not asking for alignment of their members with a particular spiritual path as a condition of membership. They're not anti-spiritual, it's just that that's not what they're focused around. To be an intentional community, you just have to have some sense of explicit common values that you're looking for alignment with. Those could be spiritual. They might be economic, social, political, environmental, psychological, or in any combination. It's just that today there is a large fraction that is secular and is not spiritual. Now, with the spiritual groups, ones that are avowedly religious, there's the opportunity to be recognized as a religion in the United States, and I'm not sure about how this works in Canada. And under that, there are certain relief available to those groups in terms of tax benefits. And for instance, their property might not be taxed, and that might be done on a state level. Income tax might be handled differently and much more easily. For income sharing groups in the United States, whether they are spiritual or not, and there are both, there is the possibility of relief from tax burden available through the IRS. There's a relatively obscure tax code called 501D. It's not used by very many groups, but it was made explicitly. This was in 1954, the last time the tax code was overhauled, to my knowledge. They created this category to recognize the economic arrangements of monastic orders. So this was meant for more like Christian groups at the time, understanding that income was pooled in those situations and that it was an unfair burden to tax the monastery and then tax the friars or sisters that were in it twice. That was considered double taxation, considering the reality of the way they organized their finances. So what it allowed those groups to do, and which is still available to intentional communities today that are secular in income sharing, which includes mine, by the way, if Sand Hill Farm operates under this tax code, we file an informational return as a corporation, but because we have income sharing and are recognized as such, we file a partnership return, which has no liability per se. We then divide all the income on a prorated basis among our members, and then we file 1040s. So this is very powerful for us in a couple ways. First of all, there's no corporate, there's no community liability. Then in addition, while I go out as a process consultant and make considerable amount of money for the community, Stan as an organic inspector and I as a process consultant account for over 50% of the community's income in a fraction of the time that we spend doing work in the world, and yet that doesn't have to appear in our 1040s. We would ordinarily have a tax liability. Instead, that goes back to the common treasury. We divide it up, and then people who do only domestic work, might only work in the garden or at home and don't directly produce income for the community, they get their share of that income is reported on their 1040. The economies we're able to achieve by being a self-sufficient homesteading farm means that when we divide all our income among all the members and report it on the 1040s and subtract our expenses, we don't have a tax liability. So we're not evading taxes, we're doing it in an open way that's recognized by the government, but we live simply enough that we're not contributing taxes to the U.S. government. Given our political analysis that we have strong objections to the way the U.S. government uses tax dollars, it's very satisfying for us to not participate in those things. Now, I want to contrast that in the case of Sand Hill with, we do participate in state taxes, which some religious groups may be able to avoid. They may be exempt from those. However, as a religious group, we are not a religious group, nor do we make any claim to be. So we do participate, and willingly, in state taxes, which go to roads, libraries, hospitals, and that kind of services, which we do participate in and which we believe in, unlike, say, the war in Iraq, which we do not believe in. So we do participate in the state level and not on the federal level. However, we do it above board and openly in a recognized way. Now, that's an advantage we have and religious groups have been always able to have access to.